This is an AQA Psychology GCSE revision video for the Paper 2 topic of brain and neuropsychology with a specific focus on the nervous system and the fight or flight response. So the nervous system is broke down into two main divisions, the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. So we will start by looking at the peripheral nervous system, which operates a bit like a post office. So the word peripheral typically means that it connects the body to the outside. So people might refer to peripheral vision, which is like the vision that they can see just on the outside corners of their eye. And this is the same for the peripheral nervous system because it receives messages from the central nervous system, which is typically your brain and spinal cord, and it sends them out to the relevant parts of the body, which is why it's like a post office, because it will receive those messages and then send them to the relevant part. The peripheral nervous system breaks down into two parts or subdivisions. The first subdivision is the somatic nervous system. Now, this is responsible for voluntary movement, so the things that we choose to do and the things that we are able to control. However, reflexes are also a part of the somatic nervous system. Generally, you will get the marks for the role of the somatic nervous system being responsible for voluntary muscle movement. Because the autonomic nervous system is the second subdivision of the peripheral nervous system, which is responsible for the involuntary or automatic movements that we have, such as digestion and heart rate, so the things that we don't need to choose to do, our body does them automatically. It's also really important in the fight or flight response. So this does break down into two further subdivisions known as the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system, which we'll look at later on in this video. Then the other main division of the nervous system is the central nervous system, which is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. And so the role of the spinal cord is the body's main line of communication to and from the brain. So it goes all along the length of our back, essentially up to our brain, and it will carry messages between the brain and the rest of our body. And then the brain is the part of us that is the decision-making centre. So it allows us to make decisions, it stores knowledge, it contains parts of our personality, and the brain stem, which is at the base of the brain, which is just before you get to the spinal cord, and that controls basic functions, such as breathing. Again, you can link it to. So focusing now on the subdivisions of the autonomic nervous system, which I did say previously breaks down into the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. They are responsible for fight or flight, which is the sympathetic nervous system, and rest digest, which is the parasympathetic nervous system. So this is the article I always use to demonstrate the role of the autonomic nervous system, the automatic involuntary responses that we have in our brain, in our body and brain, sorry. So this is an example of a woman that lifted a car because her son was trapped underneath. So it shows the role of the hormone that's called adrenaline, which is linked to our nervous systems. So she was in a very dangerous situation in terms of witnessing her son get crushed by a car, and was able to lift the car with, which would obviously weigh a lot, but was able to lift the car all by herself to get her son from under it. And that is due to adrenaline. Now, the role of adrenaline, as I said, it's a hormone, but its role, really importantly, is to promote blood flow to working muscles. It allows our muscles to contract with more force and more power, so it gives us strength in that moment when it's released. And so in moments of extreme stress or danger, an adrenaline rush allows us to unlock our muscles' true potential. So before we move on to look at the fight or flight response in a bit more detail, need some prior knowledge from earlier on in this video about the autonomic nervous system. So there will be a number of statements, 3 statements. You're going to have 5 seconds at a time to think about whether the statements are true or false. Starting with the first one, the autonomic nervous system is a voluntary system which controls vital life functions such as breathing and heart rate. This is in fact false because it's not a voluntary system. As we said, autonomic nervous system means automatic, so involuntary responses. The autonomic nervous system consists of two subsections, the somatic nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Again, this is false when you're thinking about how the nervous system breaks down. The two main divisions are peripheral and central. Peripheral then breaks down into somatic and autonomic, and central breaks down into brain and spinal cord. And lastly, the autonomic nervous system plays a role in our body's response to stress. This is true because, as we say, we're going to look at the fight or flight response now, which is the part of the autonomic nervous system known as the sympathetic nervous system, which helps us respond to stress and danger. So how it works is what we now need to look at and what you will need to understand. So you need to know what the fight or flight response actually is. It's a response that we have to dangerous or stressful situations, and it's an immediate physiological response. So because it comes from the autonomic nervous system, we don't actually get to make that judgment. It happens automatically and therefore causes the release of adrenaline, which we said is all about getting our muscles activated with force and power so that we can either fight the threat in front of us or run from it. So when we're looking at the actions of the autonomic nervous system and the things that adrenaline does to our body, I've given some examples on the sympathetic side of the table, which is when our body is getting ready to use energy in the fight or flight response, and then also in the parasympathetic subdivision of the autonomic nervous system, which is when the threat has passed and our body goes back to normal, the rest digest part. So if you pause the video, in 5 seconds we will look at the answers and you can get some notes down in terms of what happens to the body in the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. Okay, so some main ones to definitely make a note of. In the sympathetic nervous system during fight or flight, our heart rate increases. We get a dry mouth because saliva production is paused, and that's because our body doesn't need that energy right now, so it allows the energy to go to other places. Our pupils dilate, so they get bigger, allowing us to see what's in front of us and study that threat, and therefore make that judgment of whether we run away or we fight the threat. And then when that threat has been fought or we've run away from it and we're in a safe place, our body returns to normal through the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest digest, and then digestion can be increased, saliva production can be increased, our heart rate can go back to normal, go back to resting state, and our pupils constrict back to their usual size. So now we have to consider how these things actually happen, and the best way to do this is through a flowchart. So when we're thinking step by step, first of all, our brain will detect the threat. So in this example, the saber-toothed tiger, for example, evolutionary caveman days, running away from an animal that could kill you. So the brain detects the threat. That's the hypothalamus, which is a part of the brain, and that is the part of the brain that will sort of assess the environment and go, oh, I'm scared of that. And it will then tell the sympathetic part, the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system to get started. So the autonomic nervous system then changes from its resting state, which is the parasympathetic division of rest digest. So it changes, and by going into the sympathetic division, it causes adrenaline to be released into the bloodstream. Adrenaline, as we've just looked at, causes lots of changes to the body, lots of physiological changes, such as heart rate increasing, pupils dilating, and they help us to confront the threat or run away from it. And then lastly, once the threat has passed, the autonomic nervous system can go back to the parasympathetic division, that rest digest, and all those opposite things happen where our heart rate slows down, our pupils constrict, and this is known as rest digest. So that concludes everything that you need to know about the nervous system and the fight or flight response. Thank you for watching. I hope you found it useful.